Some battles do not fall apart because men lack courage. They collapse because an entire army is stretched thin at exactly the wrong moment. Isandlwana was one such battle, and it began with something as ordinary as overconfidence. On the morning of January 22nd, 1879, at the foot of Isandlwana, the British camp spread across open ground with no completed fortifications and no full defensive laager. The men believed their firepower alone was enough to contain any threat that appeared before them. But on the other side, the Zulu did not come as a wave of chaos. They had been watching, concealing themselves, holding tight formation for hours. They waited until the British force was divided before unleashing the full weight of their strength. When they were finally discovered, they did not hesitate. They deployed immediately into their familiar encircling formation. The battle did not begin with a single explosion. It began with the quiet, deliberate opening of a trap. Earlier that morning, Lord Chelmsford had taken the greater part of his force away from camp to search for the enemy. Left behind were the men under Henry Pauline, fewer than 2,000 in total. They held an open stretch of ground, tents pitched before the mountain, ammunition stores and supply wagons to the rear. No complete defensive perimeter had been established. That left them with no choice but to fight by extending their line forward into the open. Towards mid-morning, Anthony Durnford arrived with reinforcements. Rather than holding position within the camp, he moved his men forward and out to the right flank to probe the ground ahead. That decision, made quickly and without full awareness of what was approaching, stretched the British front even wider. The two wings were no longer tightly connected. An invisible gap had begun to form between the units. Meanwhile, the main Zulu force was already very close. More than 20,000 warriors lay concealed behind the folds and ridges of the land, ready to move at any moment. When they were spotted, they deployed into the horns of the buffalo formation, with the chest pressing directly forward and the two horns sweeping wide to envelop both flanks. From the British position, only scattered groups seemed to appear at first. But very quickly, the entire horizon began to move. Pauline ordered his companies out of camp. The firing line spread forward in a long sequence, red-coated soldiers dropping to one knee or lying prone, opening fire with steady, deliberate volleys. The first rounds were accurate and visibly effective. Many Zulu warriors fell as they tried to push straight into the heaviest fire. In those opening minutes, everything seemed manageable. The two 7-pounder guns behind the line also opened up, shelling clusters of men advancing uphill. Shells burst among the Zulu formations and opened temporary gaps. Direct frontal assaults were turned back. British officers saw what they expected to see, an enemy being broken apart by modern firepower. What they failed to see was that the real pressure was not coming from the front. On the right flank, Durnford had already made contact with the enemy. He was forced to fall back into a dry watercourse and hold his position there. His men fought hard, using the natural cover well, but their ammunition was uneven and running low. As the rate of fire began to drop, the Zulu pressure on that flank increased noticeably. At the same time, the horns of the Zulu formation were still opening outward. They did not throw themselves directly into the strongest part of the British line. Instead, they worked around both sides, small groups filtering through dead ground moving closer without absorbing the full weight of the defensive fire. The distance between them and the British was being reduced steadily, step by step, in a process that was slow but entirely irreversible. Across the whole front, the British were still firing well. The line still held its shape. But the sheer length of that line was becoming a problem in itself. Units were spaced too far apart to support one another in time. When a weak point appeared, there was no reserve close enough to fill it quickly. The dangerous moment had already arrived, though no one in the camp had yet fully understood it. The volleys were still regular. Discipline was still holding. But on both flanks, the encirclement was slowly closing. And once it completed itself, every advantage the British held at the start of the day would count for nothing. The British firing line had by now been extended to a dangerous length. Stretching forward from the foot of Isandlwana, each company stood far from the next, forming a thin thread of fire across the open ground. They were still shooting steadily, still holding their rhythm, but that very length meant each unit was almost entirely isolated. There was no safe depth between the sections, and when one section weakened, the whole structure began to shake. Ammunition carriers had to run from the rear up to the forward line. They carried heavy boxes across ground that was shrinking around them. With the line so long, distribution became slow and disordered. Some sections were still firing hard. Others were beginning to fall quiet. Those small silences were exactly the openings the Zulu needed to come closer. On the right, Durnford was still fighting from the dry watercourse. The terrain bought him a little more time. His men shot down the warriors pressing toward them and inflicted real losses. But the ammunition ran out, and no resupply reached them in time. When the last rounds were spent, Durnford had no choice but to withdraw. The withdrawal could not be kept in perfect order. Small groups turned and made their way back toward the camp. And in that moment, the entire right flank of the British line opened wide. The Zulu poured through the gap immediately. They did not stop to fight head-on, but drove straight into the exposed flank. Warriors moved fast, dispersed, and then converged again, maintaining constant pressure. The distance between the two sides collapsed with extraordinary speed. The long firing line began to bend. In the center, British firepower was still significant. Volleys were still pushing back the direct frontal attacks. But that central mass was only the chest of the formation. Its purpose was simply to pin. Meanwhile, the two Zulu horns had continued to swing wide, and they were now reaching toward the rear. Pauline saw the danger and tried to adjust his dispositions. Several units were ordered to pull back closer to the camp to shorten the line. But withdrawing under pressure is one of the hardest things any infantry can do. Every time a man stood up to move, his section stopped firing. And every time the firing stopped, the Zulu used that gap to push forward. The distance between the two sides was now only a matter of meters. At that range, rifles were still lethal, but no longer sufficient to stop a force so vastly superior in number. Zulu groups began to push between the gaps in the line. They did not stop. They drove straight through toward the rear. The British were now facing the enemy from multiple directions simultaneously. On the left flank, the situation deteriorated just as quickly. Zulu warriors were appearing more clearly on the exposed side. The sound of shouting and running feet came closer and closer. These were no longer distant shapes moving on the hills. They were men pressing right up against the line. The two guns continued to fire until the targets were too close. When warriors reached almost point-blank range, the artillery became useless. The gun crews had to abandon their pieces. One by one, the fixed points of supporting fire disappeared. Inside the camp, soldiers tried to build hasty defenses from wagons and supply crates, but everything was moving too fast. Before any kind of enclosed perimeter could be formed, Zulu groups were already pushing through between the tents. From that point, the battlefield had no clear direction left. Soldiers on the forward line who turned to fall back found the enemy already behind them. There was no safe rear. Every group began to fight on its own. The defensive line no longer existed as anything resembling a continuous front. The right flank collapsed first, and the effect spread across everything. Units in the center began to fall back toward the foot of the mountain. But the distance was too great, and the line of retreat had already been cut. The formation broke apart into scattered fragments. Across the whole field, the Zulu now held complete positional superiority. They were appearing in every direction. Every step the British took backwards opened another gap, and every gap was filled before it could be recovered. The battle was no longer a contest of firepower. It had become close combat. And when that happened, the outcome could no longer be reversed. When the encirclement closed completely beneath Isandlwana, no clear defensive line remained on the field. What was left were only small clusters of men, isolated in a sea of warriors pressing in from every side. There was no communication, no centralized command. Each group fought alone in a space that was shrinking around them. Near the foot of the mountain, some companies had drawn together and pressed their backs against the rock face. They tried to maintain a steady direction of fire, loading and shooting by the force of long habit. But the range was too close. Each volley dropped only a few men before the next wave came on. Inside the camp, everything had broken apart entirely. The wagons, crates, and tents were no longer a defensive line. They had become scattered obstacles. Zulu warriors threaded through every opening, leapt over wheels, and pushed in between the surviving groups. There was no longer any direction to defend. There was only the instinct to survive. The 7-pounder guns became the center of the last serious fighting. The crews held on until they could load no more. When warriors pressed in close, the gunners were forced to leave the pieces where they stood. Around them, soldiers fought on until they were overwhelmed. On what had been the right flank, where Durnford had made his stand, the situation had reduced to a pursuit. Some of the mounted men found a way through and drove hard toward the Buffalo River. But the escape routes closed quickly. Infantry on foot were slower. They were run down and forced to turn and fight again. In the center, Pulaine no longer had any control over the force as a whole. Every unit had been separated from the next. Some groups gathered around the regimental colors and formed small defensive circles, standing back to back, firing outward in every direction, trying to keep a little open space around themselves. But in that kind of open ground, such circles could not last. When one man fell, the circle opened. Zulu warriors stepped through the gap immediately. The fighting was now at the closest possible range, where a spear or a rifle butt decided everything. Across the whole field, the Zulu moved with speed and precision. They struck each new point of weakness as it appeared, and never lingered at any position longer than they needed to. Each pocket of resistance that was broken opened the way forward to the next one. The collapse spread in stages, without pause. Those who could still move tried to go east, toward Rourke's Drift. But the retreat was not safe. At stream beds and slopes along the way, they were overtaken. Many fell before they could clear the pursuit. Those who reached the Buffalo River still had a chance. They threw themselves into the water in desperation and tried to cross to the far bank. But warriors were still pressing close behind. Not everyone made it through. Behind them, the field fell gradually quiet. Not because the fighting had stopped, but because there were no longer any formations large enough to offer real resistance. Only isolated pockets remained to be extinguished, one by one. The encirclement had done what it was designed to do. Isandlwana ended in the complete disintegration of a force that had been stretched far beyond the point of recovery. From a strong firing line, they had been pushed back, outflanked, and cut into pieces. When the close fighting began, every advantage they had started with was gone. The battle did not collapse in a single moment. It was tightened ring by ring, step by step, until nothing remained to hold. And when the last ring closed, every man who had stood on that field in formation had vanished from it.